your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. Or break it on a walnut. So, for those who weren't here last week, that's what I did to my foot. So, hence the walking boot and the funny hobbling. So to understand, Jesus has these kind of intense words for us today. Our readings do. But to understand, of course, it's always helpful to understand the narrative of what's going on when Jesus speaks these words. If we go back just a little bit from the events of the gospel today to what happened just before, they're on this journey from the mountain of the Transfiguration to Jerusalem, where Jesus will be crucified. So just before the events we heard, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and goes up the mountain. They have the vision of the Transfiguration. Then he comes down, and the other 9 of the apostles are trying to drive out a demon, but unsuccessfully. And then they go along and they see this other guy driving out demons in Jesus' name successfully, and they stop him. And in between those events, they were arguing with each other. And what were they arguing about? Who is greatest among them? We're not told exactly how the conversation unfolded, but I think if we just apply a little bit of our imagination, we can begin to see the humanity in the apostles and very much see ourselves in these readings. Because when I imagine it went something like this. They're walking along. Well, why do you think we couldn't drive out the demon? Well, Peter, James, and John, we were up the mountain with Jesus having our special moment. Oh, so you think if you were there, you could have driven him out? Well, and you're saying you're better than us? You're greater than us? Well, we did get to go up the mountain with Jesus, so you said it, not me, but hey, And then there's this guy not even with them driving out demons, and they're like, come on. And then, shortly after what we read today, James and John are going to pull Jesus aside and say, by the way, we're going to sit at your right and your left in the heavenly kingdom, right? We know who your favorite is, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And poor Peter, who was also up the mountain with him, he gets thrown under the bus. So what's Peter thinking? Come on. So you see, they're struggling with all those dynamics, bruised egos, who's greatest among them. And so that's what Jesus is speaking into. He calls them to be like little children, and then he has these intense words today in that context. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. He's using strong language to get at this spiritual idea that we call holy detachment. An appropriate word since we're talking about detaching limbs. But when we talk about spiritual detachment, we mean something different than in our common speech. In our common speech, when you talk about a person being detached, often we mean in a psychological or emotional condition. That's a negative thing, a symptom of some deeper illness where they're not showing emotions, they're unresponsive to the world around them. And that is not a good and healthy thing. But when we talk about spiritual detachment, we mean something else. It's the idea that in the spiritual life, we often are clinging to things too tightly, usually with our ego wrapped up in it, over and against God. That there's things we cling onto that begin to take the place of God in our life. They become the thing that orients everything else in our life instead of God. And so the idea of detachment, spiritual detachment, is to detach from these false things, these false idols, these false gods in our life, these things that take the place of God in our life, to become detached from them so we can be rightly attached to God, and then all those other things in right relationship to that. And many of the great saints and spiritual masters of our traditions write about these things, this holy detachment. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the great teachers of our faith, when he's reflecting on the purpose of man and man's pursuit of happiness, he identifies 4 overarching things that we tend to pursue and often eclipse God in our life. Wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. Wealth, pleasure, power, honor. And none of those things are bad in and of themselves. And, of course, a certain level of all of them does contribute to a happy life. However, that many times in our pursuit of those things, we begin to pursue those things in place of God, instead of God. We try to use those things to fill the hole in our soul that only God was meant to fill. And we're ultimately left unsatisfied. Bishop Robert Barron, who's bishop of the diocese just north of us, of Winona, Rochester, Minnesota, has a quote about this. He says, "One of the most fundamental problems in the spiritual order is that we sense within ourselves the hunger for God. But we attempt to satisfy it with some created good that is less than God." Thomas Aquinas says that the four typical substitutes for God are wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. Sensing the void within, we attempt to fill it up with some combination of these four things, but only by emptying out the self in love can we make the space for God to fill us. You see, when we try to satisfy the hunger for God with something less than God, we will naturally be frustrated, and then in our frustration, we will convince ourselves that we need more of that limited, finite good. So we will struggle to achieve it only to find ourselves again and again dissatisfied. At this point, a sort of spiritual panic sets in, and we can find ourselves turning obsessively around this creaturely good that can never, in principle, make us truly happy. So we often pursue these things to fill the void in us that only God can fill. So what's the answer? Well, cut it out. That's what Jesus says. It's forceful language today. Cut it off, cut it out. What's the thing that's taken the place of God in your life? Cut it out. And usually, as we look at the apostles particularly today, so wealth and pleasure, well, in some ways they've already detached themselves from that. Peter even points out, Lord, we've given up everything to follow you, materially speaking. Okay, good. They're on the journey. They're partway there. But then, as we see, they particularly are still struggling with this power and honor. Or we might say, pride and envy is bound up in that. Always looking out towards others and seeing somehow the others' gain is somehow my loss. Or seeing that I somehow have to earn my place. Being obsessed about what others think of me or how they perceive of me. Or the apparent opposite of that, which is also a vice, the other extreme, that I don't give a darn what other people think and I'm going to do what I want and not care how they're affected by it. And while they seem like opposites, whether overly obsessing about what people think of me and how they perceive me, or saying I don't care how my actions affect anyone else, and that I'm right and I'm going to do what I want, they both have the same vice of this obsession with the self, the ego, seeing all things in relation to myself. And part of what Jesus is trying to get them to do again and again is stop obsessing and looking at yourself. Look out towards the Lord and towards others. That is love. And if it's causing you to sin, cut it out. If you're eyeing and watching the success of your neighbor and saying like, they don't deserve that, or I want that thing, envy starts flaring up, well, just pluck out your eye. Of course, we mean this all in a spiritual sense. Don't literally go home and do that. But that Jesus is trying to apply that there's this force to what he's saying. That these things that obstruct us from God, we need to cut away. That we need to humble ourselves. So if you're inflated with yourself and pride, maim yourself with humility. Better to be a humbled cripple than a prideful, powerful person who's obsessed with their self. So the readings for today invite us to this detachment. And as again we said, the apostles understand in some level detachment from wealth and from pleasure. But it's more tricky, subtle spiritual things of the self, of power, of honor, obsessing about my influence, my reputation. I remember when I was in seminary, I read a spiritual book by a priest named Father Jacques Philippe. And in it, he talked about this idea of detachment. And at that time in my life, I had stepped away from seminary, and I had joined a group of Franciscans who served the poor in the inner city of Chicago. But at the time, I was having this restlessness about where is God calling me, and I kept trying to weigh the pros and cons of, do I stay here with the Franciscans, or do I return to be a seminarian to become a priest for Dubuque? Which is the life God's calling me to? And I was weighing the pros and cons. Where can I sort of maximize most of my hopes and minimize the actualization of most of my fears? And that sort of calculative metric wasn't really getting me anywhere. So I'm reading this book in prayer, and he talks about detachment. Well, I'm a Franciscan, we embrace holy poverty, so of course I'm detached, from material things at least. But then he talks about this idea of spiritual detachment. Even having a holy detachment from the way I think my life is meant to be. In other words, or what he said is, particularly, when I think about the image of what I think my own holiness should look like, even not clinging too tightly to that. Because at the time, I realized I was attached to that. Those words he said hit home with me because I realized I was clinging to this idea of how do I live the most radical life of holiness possible? Well, go and serve the poor in the inner city, right? But there was something in me that was clinging too tightly to that. As if I was trying to prove something to myself or to others of the world. Somehow to prove there was still too much of myself obsessed in that. That I need to show the world just how holy I can be by living this radical life. And so the invitation in prayer was a holy detachment. To hold all these things with open hands. And it finally allowed me, it gave me the freedom to truly say to the Lord, not my will, but thy will be done. Whatever it is, Lord, wherever you're calling me. And it opened me up in a new way to be able to follow his call in my life. So the readings invite us to reflect on what are the things I'm attached to too much, that I'm called to a holy detachment from. What are the things that take the place of God in my life? When I think about improving my life, what is the drawing force of that? Do I merely think in terms of wealth, pleasure, power, honor, and those are the gravitational pulls in my life? Or is it the love and service of God? To know, love, and serve God, and everything else in relation to that. When I think of what I wish my life were or ought to be, even does that eclipse God in my life? That I'm clinging too tightly to that and missing how God is calling me to simply live for him here and now in the present moment. What do I need to cut out, to cut off, to become detached from? That I can truly look away from myself and out to the Lord, to follow wherever he calls, to know, love, and serve him, and to love our neighbor. Amen. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. Or break it on a walnut. For those who weren't here last week, that's what I did to my foot. So, hence the walking boot and the funny hobbling. So to understand, Jesus has these kind of intense words for us today. Our readings do. But to understand, of course, it's always helpful to understand the narrative of what's going on when Jesus speaks these words. If we go back just a little bit from the events of the gospel today to what happened just before, they're on this journey from the mountain of the Transfiguration to Jerusalem, where Jesus will be crucified. So just before the events we heard, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and goes up the mountain. They have the vision of the Transfiguration. Then he comes down, and the other 9 of the apostles are trying to drive out a demon, but unsuccessfully. And then they go along and they see this other guy driving out demons in Jesus' name successfully, and they stop him. And in between those events, they were